Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I have the great opportunity to interview Dr. Jen Gonzalez. She's a sociologist and a sexologist and is a frequent speaker about sexual empowerment, healthy relationships, body image, erotic play, sexual health, women's empowerment and nurturing, and mindfulness. In fact, she did an interview with me over at Mormon Mental Health podcast on sexuality and mindfulness a few years ago now, which did a great job, and that was awesome. So I'm so glad you're back with me again. She has presented 2 TEDx talks and is a writer on sex and relationships and is a recurring intimacy expert on the San Diego Morning News. She's also an active philanthropist and leader within the Women Give San Diego Donors Circle, and her Jen in the Den educational video series has over 1 million hits on YouTube, and that's a great resource if anybody wants to check that out, and I'll link to that. And she's also an expert in the new documentary on masturbation called Sticky, a self-love story. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
I love having you back. So the reason I reached out to you is that you recently gave a talk called The New Narrative, I believe. Is that what you called it?
That was the name of the storytelling event. The piece itself was Sex and the Price of Masculinity.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. And you gave a very personal account of a dating experience you had. And I'd like to just have you give a little bit of that background and even give a little bit of background of yourself, because I believe you're single and you're currently in a dating part of your life. So why don't we start there?
Yeah. So the picture on the storytelling event, it was called The New Narrative. And it's a friend that I have in San Diego who does storytelling events. His name's Nathan Young. And he picks them around themes. And the idea of the new narrative is that, like so many of us, we grow up learning about how we're supposed to, the shoulds of what we're supposed to do. If you should get married, you should have kids, you should get a house, like all of this sort of American dream shoulds. But so many of us are living outside of that narrative. And so that's what these events are about every few months, having people get up and share really personal stories about our struggles, about how we're not really fitting into the narrative, and how do we create new narratives that really match our identity and really feel like they really honor who we fully are in this world and bringing the best of us. And so there was one in May, and the theme was communication. And so I specifically did it around sexual communication.
So that really rings so close to home with you talking about these narratives, because obviously every culture has them. And in Mormonism, this is a big one, about marriage. And so as we talk today, because the main, I think, theme is going to be that of sexual consent and sexual dialogue, is obviously that's important in marriage as well. But I think that there's so many of our single members, both in their youth, so kind of later adolescent and college age prior to getting married, but then those who are older, single adults who never did get married or are divorced or widowed, and so therefore finding themselves yet still in that time in their lives when they still want to date. And a lot of these issues are really hard to know how to talk about, especially when the narrative is that we're not supposed to be sexual outside of marriage, and yet the experience is that many are, or are sexual in ways that they feel comfortable with, whether that means intercourse or not. So I think this is just such an important topic to be talking about.
Those shoulds about how we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to do things in life, or how we should be as a man, or how we should be as a woman, or how we should be sexually. That was something that I really dove into my Sex and the Price of Masculinity piece. I mean, that's part of why I titled it what I did, of looking at specifically man. So, in the story that I tell, I had an experience where I was very clear with this man that I'd met over Skype and that we were dating. And we finally met in person and had very clear conversations about sex and sexual health and boundaries. And for this, first time that we were getting together, and we were definitely on the same page and had very clear communication. I'm very mindful of trying to practice what I preach as a sexual health educator and as a sexologist. And he was totally on board with that. He knew what I was about, really, respected my field and my work. But when, push came to shove and things ended up happening, he ended up moving into intercourse, even though I had checked in earlier to make sure we were still on the same page again. So in the piece, I talk about how I handle that and how I made him stay and talk about it with me and talk through, and then got together and talked the next day. And because I needed some clarity on how, I thought I did everything right. I so clearly communicated we were on the same page. So how did this still happen? And so then really unpacking the masculinity piece and what I kind of gleaned from him and what I know as a sociologist of they really are taught just to, at least the hegemonic masculinity discourse in our society is around pushing boundaries, going for what you want, not giving up, being the aggressor. And men that aren't that type of sort of confident or overconfident personality can be shamed and can be stigmatized. And then how that mixes then overall with femininity and being taught to be passive or to be kind, to not rock the boat, to be a good girl. And that I think this dynamic in sexual situations, with somebody pushing and somebody acquiescing and everybody thinking they're on the same page or making assumptions about what's going on in the mind of the other. And then there's lots of this blurry, gray, somewhat non-consensual area. I think that happens all the time. We talk about rape and sexual assault and the more profound, maybe more black and white aspects of this. But this gray area, I think, infuses, I would say, majority of, I'll say, heterosexual sexual interactions in the United States. And I don't think it's being talked about in that way.
Right. Yeah, because we're not, this interview with you really isn't about talking about the obvious consents, where there's a drug slipped into the drink, and now there's
Right.
somebody who's unconscious and
Right.
being made to act in ways that they don't even remember the next morning. This is really about dating consent, people that you want to be involved with, people that you're wanting to even be sexual at some level with. And I think sometimes in religious cultures such as ours, we just deal with that by saying, well, don't be sexual at all. But then that leaves this huge chasm of information because, well, like I said, most people don't necessarily abide by that expectation, or many don't.
Right.
And then there's no place to really safely then share these experiences that have happened, or even to think through them, previously, right? Because like you're saying, you're coming at this from a very different perspective. You're a sexual educator. You kind of had these conversations to begin with. It still happened to you, which I think was what was so shocking for you.
Right.
So imagine a Mormon woman or a Mormon man who doesn't even give themselves the permission to think or talk about these things with themselves, much less another person, and then finding themselves in situations they don't know how to manage or handle.
Oh, yeah. And I think that, it's interesting when you were saying, that the advice is, well, just don't do anything sexual. It's been interesting to see the feedback that I've gotten from the video I released it released on video in early July on YouTube. And so the past couple of months and the feedback I've been getting, and there's been a small group of folks, and they seem to be kind of older generation, I guess, men and some women, that seem genuinely baffled of if we agreed we weren't going to have intercourse, then why would we do anything at all? And so that's very sort of black and white. I mean, and those of us that are sexuality professionals, we're all about, thinking outside the box and the big picture, and that intercourse or any sort of penetration of any sort are pieces of a bigger puzzle of what it is to share, a sexual, intimate, physical closeness with somebody else, and let alone being creative and playful or thinking outside the box. And so and they seem genuinely baffled by that. And then it was also this perspective of well, how could a man be expected to control himself once he's turned on? And this one woman who was really quite nasty on her YouTube comment, but then she ended up going back and deleting almost all of it, which was interesting. I hadn't commented. I'm like, I'm not even going to touch this one. But she was basically like calling me a tease or a manipulator, and I was like, what interesting. I mean, and again, a very gendered perspective on sex, and that like this aspect of having clear dialogue about it and being respectful of the human being in front of you and clearly communicating boundaries and respecting them. Like that's as if that's all so foreign and like not part of what sex should be about. I don't know.
Well, that's really interesting because we do tend to have, at least in Mormon culture, this idea that women are somewhat responsible for the actions of men in the way that they dress or provoke sexual arousal, which encapsulates a lot of what we call our modesty rhetoric, which I think is so harmful. And then again, harmful to men in this idea that somehow I'm being taught that if some line is crossed, then I'm no longer responsible for what happens.
It just makes men sort of helpless in a way, yet also monsters. Like that's just that's unhealthy all around to be teaching us that, but definitely a lack of responsibility on the male side.
I liked how you said, as you were having this moment with this particular partner, and you called him out in the moment as you were went from a romantic get together to a very clear cut conversation. You did a really important thing when you said, I wasn't afraid of him. If I had been afraid, this may have gone down very differently.
Yeah. I thought it was important to make that point that how because he got up and he was getting dressed and I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm leaving. And I'm like, no, you're not. I'm like, you're going to stay here and you're going to talk about this. Because like in that moment, I was like, if he leaves, like, I don't get any freaking explanation. I'm like, I don't get to talk. I don't like how on earth did this happen? And so in that moment, I was like, no, because I did a very quick check-in. Like, what do I feel like I need? I'm like, I need conversation. But had I actually been scared, like had he been physically overwhelming himself and forcing in that way, or had he like when I moved away from him and was like, what the hell was that? If he like attacked me back or so, so if I emotionally or physically felt in danger, I would not have asked him to stay. I would have kicked him the hell out. And so I was grateful that I had more choice in the moment, that I didn't feel physically at risk, because if that was the case, then this would have played out very differently. And I'm really grateful that I didn't. And while he crossed a very clear line, he owned it and was quite responsible around it and stayed in conversation with me. Yeah, does that speak to what you're saying?
Right. No, that's great, because I don't want to inadvertently shame people thinking, no, I didn't talk to this person when I was afraid, right? And so, but this really brings up the complexity of this, because we do tend to be so binary. It's either scary or it's pleasurable. It's either yes or it's no. It's either intercourse or it isn't. And you're describing this very, in a sense, respectful relationship to a point. And yet there was a boundary that was crossed that shouldn't have been crossed. And I think he does a good job later in the conversation with you the next day of taking responsibility for that. I think I'm going to quote you where you said, he did an assholey thing that didn't make him an asshole. And so we're getting to some pretty intricate things where I think even outside of conservative culture like Mormonism, we do tend to either make somebody kind of an evil predator or make somebody a super wonderful, loving person, right? And there's so much complexity in all of us in between those two spectrums.
It was interesting walking that line. A lot of work went into preparing this storytelling piece, and a lot of feedback from Nathan, who was running the new narrative, and the other speakers that evening. There were 6 of us all together, and just a lot of editing, and then getting feedback from men and women, trying to find that balance. But what was interesting is I identify as a feminist, but I knew that my approach to this was not necessarily going to be popular with feminists, which is upsetting to me, because I'm like, from the feedback I've gotten back, which I didn't expect, some of the really personal feedback I've gotten from women in private messages is about how I'm serving as a role model of like a really different way of being a strong, confident woman, and being, sexual in a different way and communicative in a different way. And part of that piece that really matters to me is the compassion piece, is knowing what it meant to be compassionate and nurturing to myself and knowing what I needed in that moment, but also recognizing there's another human being in front of me who already care about to some extent and who cares about me and who absolutely screwed up. But like, I think also, I mean, again, because I wasn't scared and because he wasn't attacking me and blaming me, I'm like, I can also show compassion towards him as another human being in front of me. And that's not like, if this was me even 5 years ago, I don't know that I could have pulled that off. Certainly not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or whatever. That very much for me has been my personal growth and my spirituality journey around mindfulness and meditation and compassion, and some, dabblings in Buddhist readings and philosophies of my capacity to be in a really difficult situation like that, was still in that moment recognize, well, that was, an asshole thing that he did, but I don't have to treat him as evil. I don't have to put him in a black and white category. He's just like I'm very complex, this is a very complex person in front of me. It's interesting because I did hear from one of my good friends and colleagues who is a strong feminist and strong voice against sexual assault and rape. And she said that, she's like, I had trouble with your piece, Jen. She goes, because I want to see it as black and white. And she goes, and it really challenged me. To me, that's one of the things I'm most proud of in this piece, because if we are all complex human beings. We are all, we're socialized in different ways. We have different backgrounds. We have different beliefs. We have different capacities and personalities. And most of us in general aren't trying to be malicious, even though we still hurt people. And how do we engage people in that space around these really heated topics? I think that's what's needed to make actual, lasting, sustainable change. Ooh, that was a lot.
Yeah, no. But that's very well said, because I think you're right. It takes a certain level of self-maturity to be able to do this type of work. But in a sense, you held up a mirror for him that it seemed like he had never been held up to before, either by himself or his partners. Would you say that would be accurate?
Yeah, I mean, from what he shared with me, because he was genuinely shocked by all of it and like pissed at himself that he like did something that was so disrespectful to me, but also like, screwed up our chance to date. So I think he was very shocked by that and very reflective around it, which is really impressive.
Yeah. And that there's still a boundary there that you placed. You were not going to continue to date him. This was not okay. So again, there are situations that are very black and white. There are situations where sexual assault is very direct, very power motivated, and absolutely needs to be treated like black and white situation. And then there's dating relationships where there's feelings involved and care and concern, and yet boundaries can still be crossed.
Yeah.
And how do we talk about that and discuss those things? And I'm not trying to also say that there isn't such a thing as date rape.
Oh, yeah.
I would definitely want to say that stuff. I'm not trying to take away from that title, but I'm talking about more of these types of situations where people get caught up in a moment, and instead of really knowing how to have a dialogue about it, to your point, the male tends to push forward. That tends to be the stereotype and the action that happens. And the woman tends to acquiesce and be okay with it, and how that really plays into some of these narratives that we're given about how men and women should be behaving to begin with. And so it's not just about blaming the individual. It's about really looking at our culture and how we talk about these things, how we educate our youth, how we educate our our college age students, how we really challenge some of these things from the time that we're born.
And I think that's again, I'm getting back to, because it's been really quite fascinating to study the responses, like I said, the feedback to the videos, the social media public. And I have a social media team of student interns that are working with me this fall specifically around this video and around consent and around social movements and influence on social media. And so I just had a meeting with them in the past week, and we were really studying in more detail some of the YouTube responses and the folks that are attacking the video or attacking me. And one of the interesting things is, in response to what you just said, is that there does seem to be a belief by a lot of folks. And this is, I'm a sociologist, so it's so hard for me to comprehend this, but it was really important to see that there's a number of folks that I think empathized with me and in the video and what happened to me, but didn't like that I was characterizing it as masculinity socialization. That they were just like, no, he's an asshole. He's a jerk. He's a bad man. Like, I think they wanted it in that black and white narrative and not wanting that nuance. I guess that idea of just that sex is natural and there's a way to do it and there's not a way to do it, and to not realize that we've all been trained in that. And you go to different cultures and people do sex in different ways and have different beliefs around it and even what turns them on or not. And so there's been an interesting underlying denial of the existence of how we learn social norms, and that we learn sexual norms, and that's a part of it, and how we do things sexually. It's baffling to me because I'm so immersed in viewing the world as a sociologist. I'm not even sure how to come back at that. And again, that was part of my compassionate approach, being like, I get it. Like, you were trained in masculinity. And then that there's people that are empathizing with me, but they're like, no, you're being too nice to him, or something like that. He didn't learn this. Like, that's not a real thing. He's just an ass. Mm. I'm like, I'm not even sure what to do with that.
Right. Right, where we want to just put the entire onus on an individual instead of see where the individual's coming from and why that.
Yeah, right. That they're a complex individual. They're not just good, good or evil type of thing, but that we all have a complexity within us. So, yeah.
So how do we get into, you mentioned earlier briefly some of these messages that both women and men get. Can we delve into a little bit more of that as far as what are some of the socializations that we get that can lead to some of these problems? And then you also mentioned at the end of your video that you've had plenty of sexual encounters with men where this hasn't happened at all. Yeah. And so what can lead to good sexuality? How do we start defining consent, and how do we start looking at consent in a way that isn't this robotic, is this okay? Is this okay? Versus, and still be able to feel comfortable in any given situation. So, I guess it's a lot of things all at once. Okay. But let's start out with the socialization messages.
Yeah, I've been talking about men some. I do think, although it's absolutely changing and morphing and always is in our society, I do think in general, the underlying message that a lot of boys get growing up is like, be a man, don't cry, don't be emotional, and that they're, they can be shamed, they can be teased, they can be beaten by their dads if they're showing weakness. And that, there's a great documentary out, and there was one about women in the media called Misrepresentation. I don't know if you ever heard of that or saw that, but then the same filmmaker followed up and did one about men that came out this year. And it's something called like The Mask We Live In. And it's all about masculinity. And exactly what I'm talking about here. I actually saw it this documentary a few weeks before I did my new narrative talk. And so it actually helped shape and influence my talk a bit. And it was men, like teenagers and young men in, of all racial, ethnic backgrounds, and just talking about how isolated and alone they end up feeling often by teenage years, because they're not supposed to talk about what makes them sad, or they have to hide their anger, or then they burst out in anger. And it's just this mask that they put up because they're not given necessarily safe spaces where they get to fully be themselves in the full range of human emotions and all of our beauty and messiness. And that they keep hiding behind that, and they feel lonely, they feel isolated, they feel angry, they feel sad. And that some folks that are doing work around that in young men's groups to create safe spaces where men can talk about these things, where they can cry, a very normal, healthy human thing to do. But that's shamed out of so many men in this sort of stoicism that they're taught. And then you translate that to a sexual realm. The piece that men should be competitive, they should be confident, they should go for what they want, and that you're not a real man if you don't. You put all those pieces together and you get a man that and then maybe throw in some alcohol or something like that, but You get a man that shows up in a sexual situation that is really stuck in his own head, hasn't necessarily been taught emotional intelligence to know what's going on with himself, let alone to be able to read the person in front of him. And then he's taught to just go for what he wants. He assumes that, if it's a woman in front of him, that she's thinking and wanting the same thing he is, because if you're in the same situation, then she must want that same thing. And they're not taught to how to communicate or check in, and they just plow through things. Then on the flip side, then the femininity piece of a lot of women are taught, and I use the good girl, quote unquote, ideology of like, don't rock the boat, be nice, be a pleaser, make the other people feel good about you, put your needs last, don't be too sexual, you need to be responsible, don't be a slut, but make sure you perform well or make your man happy, all of those type of things. And you put those pieces together. And I say this towards the end of the piece, one of the reasons why I really decided to speak on this topic and share a really personal, vulnerable story that I actually really didn't want to share in a public way like this, was because when I shared this story with a group of sorority women, like 25 of them, and they were just kind of stunned. And the response was they were so surprised that I stopped it in the moment, that I stopped his action when he crossed the boundary. And they're like, we would have just gone along with it. I think that we have so much awkwardness as women about rocking the boat and wanting to be liked, and then awkwardness as men of not knowing their emotions and being taught to not be in touch with them, and that everybody wants to avoid that awkwardness, and then folks use drugs and alcohol just to kind of numb it, and then you just plow through things. So yeah, does that all make sense?
Absolutely. And it's a lot of what Peggy Ornstein talks about in her book Girls and Sex that came out.
Which I have not read yet, yes, but I know that.
Yeah, and I just heard her speak at a conference. So
nice.
It was really great to see her talk about some of this research, that these messages that get in the way, and to your point, that alcohol just exacerbates a lot of that, which happens a lot on college campuses.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting with the brain mapping work that we see that men and women really aren't that different emotionally. And so, but we act really differently emotionally, right? And so you can see how powerful these kind of culturalizations are as far as how women and men are allowed to deal with their emotions in any given culture. And in a sense, women in our culture, I think, have been taught to be way too tied to their emotions or other people's emotions, and men not enough to any.
Right.
Which is kind of what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. We end up on extreme ends of the spectrum a lot of times, but don't realize how far of a gap there is. At least in our ability to handle our emotions responsibly. Right? Because like you said, we're all humans. We've got these full range. Men, women, everybody has this full range of human emotions. But how much are you taught to be in touch with it, aware of it, articulate it, have the empathy and compassion to read it in others, and then to make responsible choices around it? In general, I don't think anybody's taught those things. I've learned them through, again, my own kind of personal growth practice, specifically through mindfulness and meditation. But in general, I don't think we're taught that. Yeah, we all handle it in really different ways, but generally not responsible ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you talk, because if I didn't know any better, and if you weren't talking about, I guess, some of your sexual experiences, I'd be like, that's so Mormon. But it's really... And I think a lot of times as people are dealing with their own faith transitions or faith journeys, they blame Mormonism for a lot of these sexual messages. But these are universal. I mean, these are really things that so many of us are dealing with.
Yeah.
And Mormonism may have its own quirks to it.
Right.
Or its own ways to hone in on certain topics or certain themes. But this is really something that most people are struggling with at one level or another, and that we see so much talk about, especially right now on college campuses.
Yes.
So let's delve into then, what is consent? How do we get past some of these negative things? What do we want to be teaching about? How do we start having conversations or teaching people to have conversations either with themselves, kind of like you're saying, in a mindful or self-aware approach, or with others, that can avoid some of these pitfalls?
It's not an easy path forward because I think it requires a whole bunch of things. Like, one, I think, is general education around gender differences about how we are socialized to be different and how we are socialized to be different around emotions, around sexual expectations. There is a very real difference also, I think, in having a penis and penetrating something and being penetrated. And I do think there's just maybe some, even as a sociologist, I'm going to say, I think there's some biological components about the difference of, the power dynamics around that and what that feels like emotionally and vulnerability levels around that. There's just some basic, fascinating gender research about, again, even in college students, about how men and women read the same sexual situation very differently. And so to at least have that seed planted that like the way you're looking at it it's quite possibly not at all the way your partner's looking at that. So just that basic, like, get your head out of your own ass, first of all. And second, I think some really heavy training around emotional intelligence and specifically compassion. I say this in the Sex and the Price of Masculinity, like, sex and anything sexual that we're sharing with another human being is so intimate and so personal and close. Like, should not the bar that we hold be even higher respect and higher care and compassion for this human being, this vulnerable human being in front of us? Yet somehow it almost goes in the opposite direction of, how much you feel like you need to respect somebody that you're being sexual with. And that's mind-boggling. So, I mean, I really do think compassion, education, humanity, like this shared humanity aspect, and of no places is it more poignant, than in a sexual interaction with somebody else. And I do think the piece of awareness around alcohol and how it changes your decisions and your awareness. Also, why you're using alcohol. Are you using alcohol to numb yourself? Are you using alcohol because you actually want to be sexual, but you don't want to be shamed for it, so you use alcohol as an excuse, and then like, oh, well, I was drunk, or, so, and just a greater level of awareness around that. And then the piece of actually in the moment of like, what does it look like to have an enthusiastic partner who is, you're getting enthusiastic yeses and enthusiastic responses from them. I've had some lovely experiences with men who, and it's actually interestingly, some of these men do not have particularly high emotional intelligence skills. They were more like scientists now that I think of it. But they were very present in a sexual interaction with me and attuned to even slight shifts. And so I could think of a couple experiences with men, and they'd check in and be like, hey, are you okay? Or, you feeling okay with this? Or one of them even asked, and I said this in the narrative piece, are you feeling pressured right now? I'm like, what a fascinating question to ask. It doesn't have to ruin the moment, right? You don't have to stop, every 5 seconds or 10 seconds or something like that. It is a presence and respect for the person that's in front of you in the moment. I mean, that's what it comes down to. But those aren't necessarily easy skills to build. So a verbal checking in and a looking for, we generally know the difference between enthusiastic versus boredom versus acquiescence, and even having the mindset that you're going to pay attention to things like that, and that matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot. There's no simple answer.
Sure. So let's start with number one that you mentioned, which is general education. And this is a problem we have in general in our countries, that we do not really offer comprehensive sexual education. So sexual education really comes in the form of reproduction education and avoiding disease, information,
right,
or pregnancy information. And it's really not focused so much on the relational aspect or even the pleasure aspect of sexuality.
Right.
Because I still think that most adults have this anxiety around our youth being encouraged or given permission to have sexual pleasure.
Right.
That somehow if we talk about that or teach that they're going to have more sex.
Again, we know the research shows that over and over again. It just actually makes them better critical thinkers and they make healthier choices for themselves.
Right.
The more informed they are. Yeah.
And there hasn't been any successful strategy to make teenagers asexual that I know of. And
Right.
so, or young adults asexuals. I don't know that that's a realistic goal. And so therefore, if we're going to respect and honor the fact that people are sexual regardless of the developmental stage of life they're in, it's interesting to note that the more information they have, the safer choices they make.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and we know some of this coming from Europe, with actually the age of intercourse being quite later than the age of intercourse
Yes.
here in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean European kids aren't being sexual, but
Right.
they're just finding different ways to express themselves and to have fun together that are not intercourse related.
Yeah, I was a side note on that. I was just actually interviewed for a podcast a couple days ago. The woman was Skyping me from Tel Aviv. And so she's lived in Israel for like 20 years, but was in the United States before that. And she has a family there and all. And we were talking about the differences, and that they have a very, very low teenage birth rate there. But right, it doesn't mean the teens aren't having sex. She said her perspective of her and her husband and of many parents they know is that they have condoms available. They talk about sex. It's a normal, natural part of being a teenager. They'd rather have it happen under their own roof. Provide condoms and know who they're with and know that they're safe. And I was like, that blew my mind, because that is so counter, I think, to most American parents. They don't want to see it. They don't want to know what's happening. They want to pretend it's not happening. And that does not protect your children. Burying your head in the sand does not protect your children. They're out there doing it, and then you don't have any ability then to teach them your values, to teach them healthy decision making, to make sure they're using condoms, to know who they're with. Yeah, it was amazing. I'm like, that is so counter. And it works. Like, rates of STDs and teens births are way lower than in the United States. She said specifically several times that's not the really religious folks, that they have a very different perspective. But she did say in general, her and other folks like her in more secular perspectives around sex were like that. And I was like, that to me is what it means to protect your teens.
Right. Yeah, and it is difficult in a culture like ours, where obviously the sexual value is to wait until a committed relationship, and not just a committed relationship, a marital relationship,
Right.
to start experiencing sexuality. And that, I think, is a pretty common value within Mormonism.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
at the same time, we do see a lot of these similar issues, and why I think it's important to have the categorical education available. You can still say, this is my value. This is what I hope for
Right.
you. This is what I
Right.
want. These are the reasons maybe why I feel these would be the best decisions in your life. At the same time, I think we forget in Mormonism, we have this great principle of agency. We do believe people have the right to their own agency. And so if your agency is going to lead you in a different way, or is going to lead you in a way that I would not prefer, here's some really good information for you to have.
Yeah.
So that we're avoiding some of these things. I think that's a very difficult thing for religious people to navigate, because they want to teach their values and not necessarily give other options.
Yeah, and that's a shame, because I think the combination of those things together are really what is most powerful. That's going to create, I think that's your best chance of creating offspring that you're really most proud of, in terms of that they really do know how to make healthy choices for themselves. And they really did listen to you and get the values, but they also learned to listen to themselves, and they learned through their trial and error, and like that balance of what it is to be a fully expressed human being who's very responsible and high integrity, like to have, both sides of those conversations. And I mean, and the research shows kids want that from their parents. They want to know what their parents think about these topics. So yeah, it's just having the courage to have those conversations.
Yeah. So we talked about gender. Tell me a little bit about what you mean when you say emotional intelligence, because I think you and I know what that means.
Yeah.
But how would we explain that concept to a broader audience?
Yeah, emotional intelligence. I don't know if I have a good definition of it. That's a good question. It's emotional intelligence, I think most fundamentally is awareness of what emotions we're feeling. Oftentimes, whether we're aware of it or not, we've got all sorts of emotions that are hitting us, whether it's happiness, sadness, boredom, stress, anxiety, shame, fear, disappointment, resentment, whatever. Full range. They just come and go. It's like, I like to use the analogy of being on on top of the ocean with the waves just kind of throwing us around. That's what our emotions are like. And if we're not aware of them, if we're not shining a bright light on them, and then they just run us. And so emotional intelligence is awareness of what our emotions are, the ability to notice them, to acknowledge them, to label them, to know what they are. There's a lot of power in labeling our emotions, and then recognizing that we can make healthier choices that feel more in integrity with who we are, yet also being fully expressed. And then once the greater awareness we have of that in ourselves, the better we're able to then be empathetic to others, empathetic to the suffering of others, empathetic to celebrating successes with somebody else, and being able to read those nuances and emotions in someone else. What would you add to that definition?
I think that's a great definition.
Okay.
In a
Okay.
sense, being aware of how maybe your emotions are informing your decisions.
Yeah.
And a lot of times
Yeah.
we're not really thinking about that. We think our decisions
Yeah.
are super rational and logical,
Oh my.
and oftentimes not so much.
Well, and that is the thing that drives me crazy. Like when I hear people talk about corporate America or business decision making, and particularly it is a more sort of, masculine view on things, although that is changing in the United States some. But, and then it's like, there's no emotions, it's all logic. And I was like, that's BS. Because you could see people make decisions all the time based on their ego, based on needing to feel important, based on resentments, getting their feelings hurt, disappointment, all sorts of things. But they say they're making rational decisions. I was like, that's no. You're just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Which goes back to that gender piece, which
Yes,
men
absolutely.
are assumed to be less emotional than women, which is not the case really at all.
No, right, exactly. But they actually seem to think they are, which is fascinating.
Right.
Oh,
All right,
yeah.
so let's spend the rest of the time then really delving into this last piece that you said, which is, what does it look like to have sexual enthusiasm? In other words, how do we communicate? How do we check in? What are some dialogues that we could give examples of for people in the realm of dating and starting to kiss or make out or touch? And what are some ways that are not super ako taco that kind of shuts down the whole passion, but at the
Right.
same time, to your point, can be part of the sensual play and the compassionate check-in that drives passion and drives excitement? And then at what point can we stop or say, I've had enough, without it being a pure rejection or this, hurtful type of thing? Let's just kind of delve into that world a little bit.
Yeah. So, one of the things that crossed my mind when you said this is I think some of it is shifting, right? Because these conversations can be incredibly awkward. And just like, I've been in the sexual health field for, I don't know, I think 23 years ago, I became a sexual health educator for the first time. And so many people view putting a condom on like you're ruining the moment, you're ruining spontaneity. It's not romantic anymore. You're taken out of the moment. And it doesn't have to be at all, right? It could be very sexy. Either person can put a condom on. And so in the same way, shifting our mindset, like moving to a different paradigm about how we view consent, that conversations in this way are very vulnerable, which is why they're awkward. But vulnerability brings us closer to somebody.
It's
to
sexy.
be able to, yeah, exactly. You're having an intimate act with somebody else. So having vulnerable conversations can absolutely bring you closer together in your awkwardness, in your vulnerability, in all of it. It really is just having the courage to have the self-respect for yourself of like knowing where your boundaries are, knowing how you feel about something, knowing this could be awkward and that's okay. And that you're not judging yourself for that, you're not judging the other person for it, and you're creating this safe space. So I think shifting the mindset of being like, no, this can actually bring us closer together, instead of I fear that this is going to put up a wall between us or put distance between us. So that, first of all. And then in the moment, I mean, I do think, just a occasional, most simply check-ins of like, hey, how you doing here? You doing okay with this? Or do you want a different position? Or is this working for you? And genuinely being open to whatever feedback you get. Because ideally, you're there and you're doing things that feel good to you and that you're doing things that feel good to the other person. So you genuinely want to know, does this feel good to you or not? Is this working for you or not? And so it's kind of this, I guess, egoless state, which is hard in the sexual realm, but trying to make it more about the other person than you. And hopefully they're doing the same thing and it'll kind of balance out, at least in terms of, what's going on for you. And the thing is, though, I know lots of women that, like, this isn't going to change overnight. Even if, say, there's a man listening to this and he's going to do this with the next woman he's with or something like that. This may be so new to her. It may make her feel so uncomfortable. She may not know what she likes or doesn't like in the moment. She may not be sure. She may feel so awkward and embarrassed saying anything that she may not give honest answers. I mean, and that's a whole nother level of complexity, but that is part of the femininity socialization also, I think, and just her general awkwardness around sex as a society. However, if the more you do this, the more people are going to trust that they can be honest with you. The more, bit by bit, the more we stand this level of communication and awareness and concern for the person in front of us. I don't want to say concern because that can have its own weird side, but awareness, like just awareness and compassion for the person in front of you. The more comfortable you become with it, the smoother you become, the more that the people you're with can start to develop that level of awareness of themselves and communicating. So how much this works in one night stands, I don't know. It's an ongoing process of learning how to do this and learning to check in with somebody else. Yeah. And then you said that the enthusiasm thing. I mean, and that is think in general, when somebody's enthusiastic, they're like, woohoo! They're like, oh yeah, oh, this is great. They're making sounds. You look at their facial expressions, there's this sort of full body thing versus somebody who's half-heartedly doing something or who's hesitant to do something. I think in general, if you're paying attention, you can read the differences in people's facial expressions or in their vocalizations, although, people vocalize at all different levels or not in sexual interactions. So I don't know. Again, I don't have any black and white answers around any of this.
Right. It's all very individualized to the situation. But I like certain points you made, like the verbal point. I mean, some people are very verbal. You don't really have to wonder too much. It's like, this is awesome, or moaning and totally into it. Other people are not so expressive and yet are still very much having an enjoyable time.
Right.
But are more silent about it. And so that might be confusing. I think, too, that there's also people who are conflicted in of themselves. For example, boy, this feels really good. I really like how he's touching me right now. Oof, I'm not sure I should be doing this, from a values perspective, right? And so the partner might be sensing some hesitation and to even be able to say, like, gosh, I really like this. I'm so enjoying this. I'm just not sure I'm comfortable as far as my own brain space, and that's an okay thing to say. And it's okay to back up at that point and just say, okay, so let's take a breather and see how you can feel about this.
And that's hard for a lot of people in the moment.
Yeah.
They're feeling rejected, or they're so revved up and they're feeling like dropped, or they're feeling used, or but that level of communication I think is fantastic. That awareness of self, that willingness to say it, and even throw in there, like, genuinely, like, this is not you. Like, I'm really enjoying you and I am really enjoying this, but, something, I feel like I'm crossing boundaries of my values here. And this feels, I keep coming back to integrity. We all have our own level of integrity, but, this feels out of integrity for me. Please know you're not doing anything wrong. And to speak from that place and to emphasize that to the other person so that they don't feel rejected, that you still have a voice and still get to put your boundaries up. Yeah.
And even post, if, for example, I've heard of people coming in to see me and they're like, yeah, I thought we had a great time and we both had an orgasm, and then all of a sudden she or he was in tears. And I'm like, okay, well, so then a lot of times, especially if you're with somebody who doesn't necessarily share your religious values, you can take that really personally. Like, was I a bad lover? Did I scare them? Did I pressure, even though I thought all the signs were a yes and a go? And again, that's not understanding maybe the complexities of that decision at that time, and to be patient with yourself and with others as you realize this isn't always about me and you. This is about a lot of bigger messages and what this might mean for us, or expectations we have of ourselves, and whether or not we feel good about the decision we just made. So yeah, it's tough to think about those things and talk about those things. And since we're not usually good about talking to them, then a lot of assumptions are made.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, all the time. And we have no idea which are assumptions, which is true, absolutely. I have this line in my piece, sometimes why we need to be talking more and doing less.
Right.
Because we just kind of we plow through stuff and we do it all, but we're not talking about it before, during, or after. And again, I get, like, men are socialized not to do that, some of them. And so that's not necessarily a skill they have, but it doesn't mean they can't develop it. And so, and even if you're one of those dudes and you're with somebody and she starts crying afterwards, sit in that space. It doesn't mean you're bad. It doesn't mean you're evil or you've done something quote unquote wrong. But how you handle that situation, matters a lot. Are you going to come from compassion? Are you going to stay present with that person and hear it out and have your voice in all of it? And avoid going to a place of blaming and shaming, which is where I think so many sexual conversations go to. Difficult sexual conversations end up there. And no wonder people want to avoid them, or no wonder people shut down, because that stuff feels horrible.
Yeah, my favorite part of your piece that you did is when you invited this gentleman to speak with you the next day, outside of your bedroom, outside of the space where you had your initial conversation. I see a lot of people who, for whatever reason, if it's, I feel guilty that I did this, or I'm not comfortable with what you did, or whatever it is, they just drop the relationship altogether.
Yeah.
Because that, you never hear from them again, in a sense, even though one of the persons might be really trying to continue the relationship. And again, it's not because the relationship in of itself was bad, or because either person was bad. It's just the conversation is so hard to have that people just opt out. And that's a shame.
Yeah. I mean, talk about an awkward conversation. I didn't look forward to it, and part of me really didn't want to have it, but I felt like, and I because I was studying myself, I was like, okay, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I feel like it's respectful of him since he's down here to see him again, or that I owe it to him in some way, or do I need it for me and closure, or like, what do I need? And it was all kind of lumped together, but I really did most feel like there was a sense of closure needed, and just some more answers, and actually giving us both the space to have more voice. So in a way, as awkward as it was to me, it was compassionate towards me, even though it was really uncomfortable, and compassionate towards him, even though it was really uncomfortable. Just that we both had more of a voice around what happened. And as I say in the piece, like, it really did matter to me then to know how he was going to do something differently in the future. Because after he left that night, and I was thinking about all sorts of stuff, the night before, and I was like, all right, like, I know I'm strong enough and resilient enough, and I feel like I handled myself well in the situation, and I'm glad I stopped it, and I'm okay. But I needed to feel like there was a bigger purpose for having to go through a shitty situation like that. And I was like, a bigger purpose for me would at least feel like I was being of service to future women in his life, and knowing that he was going to do something different. And so, like, that conversation mattered to me. And I guess, I don't know if that's, the educator at heart that I am, or just because I do all of this work because I want to be of service and really make a difference and help people and reduce suffering in the world. I'm not quite sure what the motivation behind that was, but that mattered to me. So yeah, that was awkward.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And given some of these other experiences that we're addressing, for you, I think that was especially hard because there was a boundary crossing, but especially for those where there isn't necessarily a boundary crossing, but there's still something that felt,
Ugh.
you know, not so great about the experience, and
Right.
and being able to address that with that person and with yourself is just such an opportunity for personal growth, I think.
Yeah.
To me, what's most heartbreaking is when really good relationships, I see this a lot in Mormonism, is really good dating relationships get ruined because there's premarital sex. And so the guilt of that, even though they're they're really respectful towards each other and really both wanted, were consensual, I guess, but then having to deal with how difficult that feels to have gone against your own religious value in that sense, and then that's what ends up breaking them up.
Ugh, what do you do with that?
I know. This is why I'm encouraging dialogue. Encouraging dialogue.
Very cool.
And like maybe this isn't, maybe we have to face the fact that we went against something religious here for us, but at the same time there's still all this wonderfulness between us. And
right. And that, well, and this is interesting because this perspective may go counter to some Mormon beliefs, but like for me, if somebody came to me with that, I would look at the guilt. Well, and literally, like, where are you feeling guilt in your body, but how is the guilt serving you, and how can you shift around that? Because I think the guilt we use to beat ourselves up because of something that you did that was out of integrity. But if the act is already passed and you've already done that, you can't go back and change it. So now you're just beating yourself up. And if you're also beating down a really good relationship or something that otherwise has so much beauty and love and caring and commitment in it, you're definitely adding suffering to the world that isn't necessarily serving anything except getting stuck in place. So, which I know a lot of religious beliefs are like, yeah, that's what we want you to do, or to sit with the guilt. But I don't know. I always bring it back to, like sort of somatically, where's that located in our bodies and how is that serving us? And then how do we have the courage to move through it with our choices and our decisions, and then still be happy and still know we're good people, but learn and grow from it. So I don't know.
Right.
Oof. Yeah, that's not an easy one.
That's hard.
Yeah.
Well, I know that I've kept you for as long as I said I would. So what would you say would be your closing thoughts about consent, about empowerment, personal empowerment, and what do you want to leave us with?
Well, one thing just to say, because since we were talking about parents talking to their teens, around my sex and masculinity video on YouTube, I made a specific worksheet for parents. If you want to sit down with your teens, and particularly before they're going off to college, and have a conversation about sexual consent, I made a worksheet that folks can use the video as a tool, an educational tool. So you and your team both sit down together, separately watch the 21-minute video, and then I have a worksheet that walks through reflection questions. I pull quotes from the video, and then give questions to have dialogue. And I mean, and this is dialogue that I know 99% of parents are not having with their teens ever. And probably depth of topics that most teens are never even reflecting on or thinking about. So if that resonates with any parents out there, that's a free, it was a lovely mindfulness bell there. That's a free worksheet that I have on my website that they can access. And then otherwise around personal empowerment, how do I summarize that? I don't know. I would say, I mean, if there's one take-home piece, it is keep working on your emotional intelligence. Like, there's fantastic books out there on it. Even just every day reflecting on, at the end of the day, like, what were my big emotions that I felt today? Where did I make decisions that maybe came from emotions that I didn't even know it? And just do journaling and reflection on that. Just that continual awareness around your emotions and how they are informing your decision making. both your positive and your negative emotions, and developing more awareness around that, and then further developing empathy and compassion for other humans from that place. I mean, to me, that's a key part of the epitome of empowerment, is being able to make informed choices for ourselves with that awareness, and then the ability to be kind to others from that place.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being with us, and I just want to give you a huge shout out for the vulnerability that you expressed in this video. I think that is very difficult as a professional to put yourself out there in that way, and yet I think that's I think that's a very empowering move for you and for others to be able to see that example.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, because it was for so many reasons I did not want to do it and put it out there. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary
a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary ordinary.
Ordinary.
No, it's extraordinary.